Is it possible for a literary classic to actually be kind of bad history? Now, George Orwell's famous first-hand account of the Spanish Civil War, Homage to Catalonia, is an absolute masterpiece of reportage. I mean, it's pretty much shaped how the entire English-speaking world views that brutal conflict. But what if one of history's greatest observers just entirely missed the big picture?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the fascinating clash between Orwell's gripping personal memoir and the honestly staggering massive complexities of 1936 Spain. We're going to use historical analysis from historian Paul Preston alongside records of the Spanish Revolution to figure out exactly where the micro-experience of a deeply honest eyewitness collides with the macro-realities of geopolitics.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, Orwell's corner of events. 2. The Summer of Anarchy. 3. Collectivizing the economy. 4. The Barcelona May Days. And finally, memoir versus macro history.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Orwell's corner of events.
So George Orwell arrived in Spain in April 1937, right? He was driven by this profound decency and a real desire to fight fascism. But his actual experience of the war was incredibly hyper-localized. He fought for a quasi-Trotskyist militia called the PUM, which is pretty ironic considering he only joined them because the British Communist Party rejected him over his, quote, cut-glass Eton accent. Because of that, Orwell ended up on a quiet sector of a quiet front in Aragon. His day-to-day reality wasn't about grand military strategy, it was freezing cold, paralyzing fear, and the intense squalor of excrement, lice, and just completely rat-infested trenches. Now, when Orwell initially arrived in Barcelona before hitting the front, he was absolutely exhilarated. He famously described finding, quote, a town where the working class was in the saddle. To him, seeing a genuine, breathing, egalitarian revolution in action like that was just an absolute triumph of the human spirit.
But let's contrast that boots-on-the-ground feeling with the view from the very top. Dr. Juan Negrin, the Spanish Republican Prime Minister who was trying to coordinate the entire defense against fascist forces, actually spoke with Orwell later on in London. And Negrin described Orwell as idealistic and weltfremd, which basically translates to unworldly. You see, Negrin saw an incredibly fragmented, chaotic war effort made up of largely unconstitutional local governments and completely incompatible unions. He was desperate to centralize the military just to stand a chance against the fascists. Orwell, at least at first, really didn't grasp this overwhelming logistical nightmare.
Moving on to Section 2, the Summer of Anarchy.
To really understand this, we need to aggressively zoom out from Orwell's trenches and look at the staggering scale of the social revolution that kicked all this off. On July 17, 1936, a military coup tried to overthrow the Second Spanish Republic. The Republican state essentially collapsed, and stepping right into that massive power vacuum were the worker unions. Just to put this in perspective, 1,577,000, that was the approximate membership of the massive anarcho-syndicalist union, the CNT, right at the outbreak of the war.
And they definitely weren't alone. They were matched by the UGT, the Socialist Union, which boasted over 1.4 million members of its own. So when the military rebelled, it was this massive armed working class that suddenly stormed the barracks, erected barricades, and basically took over local administration overnight.
The scope of this revolution was truly unprecedented. I mean, think about your own city for a second. In anarchist strongholds like Catalonia, up to 75% of industry was put entirely under worker control. This wasn't just a simple change in government. This was a total socioeconomic transformation, where the means of production were literally seized by the workers in a matter of days.
Which brings us to Section 3, collectivizing the Spanish economy.
This whole shift wasn't just about massive factories either. Worker control reached everywhere. Everyday businesses, we're talking hotels, barbershops, restaurants, were stripped from private owners and run entirely by local worker committees. They collectivized the film industry. They grouped small woodworking shops into these massive cartels. Across regions like Aragon, widespread agrarian communes were established on libertarian socialist principles. It was this astonishing, sprawling social experiment happening right in the middle of a brutal war.
But right here is where the fatal fractures within the anti-fascist forces really start to emerge. It's kind of an alphabet soup of factions, so let's break it down neutrally. On one side, you had the revolutionary factions, like the anarchist CNT and the Marxist POEM that Orwell fought for. Their main goal was social revolution and independent worker control, with a big focus on agrarian communes.
On the other side, though, were the centralizing factions, the Communists, the Catalan generally taught, and the Central Republic. Their absolute priority was rolling back that revolution to build a centralized state and an efficient modern war machine. And crucially, they desperately needed an alliance with the Soviet Union because they were the only major power willing to sell them weapons. This deep internal contradiction, it was a ticking time bomb.
And that leads us to Section 4, the Barcelona May Days.
That ticking time bomb finally went off in May 1937, right in front of Orwell. Now, he initially assumes the fighting was mostly communist malevolence suppressing the revolution, but the macro data paints a really different picture. Barcelona experienced a staggering 40% population surge, comprised entirely of 300,000 refugees fleeing the fascists. That placed an absolutely crushing strain on the city's housing and food resources. So the political tension was fundamentally rooted in this severe, everyday economic distress.
This situation led to deeply conflicting and ultimately failing food policies. The anarchist CNT tried to solve the crisis through rural food requisitions, which angered farmers who then hoarded their stock, leading to severe shortages and inflation. Then, when the PSUC communists took over the supply ministry, they implemented a market-based approach, which absolutely infuriated the anarchists, but still completely failed to solve the crisis. The direct result of all this? Literal bread riots in the streets of Barcelona and armed clashes over food stores long before the famous May Days formally even began.
This boiling point rapidly spilled over into outright warfare. Following those early bread riots, the immediate catalyst arrived on May 3rd. The central government seized the main telephone exchange in Barcelona from the anarchists. Why? Simply because an anarchist operator had interrupted a phone call from the Republic's president. That one action sparked days of intense street fighting. By May 7th, massive police reinforcements arrived from Valencia to crush the resistance. In the grim aftermath of this clash, the revolution Orwell had so admired was systematically dismantled, culminating in the murder of poem leader Andrei Unin by Soviet agents.
Let's wrap things up with Section 5, Memoir versus Macro History.
George Orwell was a brilliantly honest writer, and to his immense credit, he recognized his own limitations later on. He actually wrote acknowledging, and I quote, "my partisanship, my mistakes of fact, and the distortion inevitably caused by my having seen only one corner of events." He didn't speak Spanish, he didn't read Spanish books about the origins of the war, and he was completely isolated from the geopolitical chess game that forced the Republic to appease Stalin just to get guns.
Today, historians point to this brutal, totally impartial reality. The collectivist experiments of the working class, while incredibly egalitarian and inspiring on a human level, had not created a war machine capable of defeating Franco, Hitler, and Mussolini. Even Orwell himself later admitted in 1942 that nationalizing factories and issuing revolutionary manifestos didn't actually make armies more efficient. To fight a modern, mechanized war, the central authorities argued a centralized state and modern arms were just an absolute necessity.
So we end this explainer with a provocative thought. Homage to Catalonia is a beautifully written, absolutely essential testament to human decency in the trenches, but it missed the sweeping macro realities of geopolitics and economics that actually decided the fate of Spain. And that leaves us with a vital question to ponder the next time we read a gripping first-hand account or a news piece today. If even the most deeply honest eyewitness only ever sees a fraction of the truth, how do we piece together the whole story? Thanks for exploring this with me today. Keep questioning the whole picture, and I'll see you next time.